Hear this word from the book of Job, chapter 38, verses 1 through 7. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all of the heavenly beings shouted for joy?" May these words be to us our light and our life. In 2011, Japan experienced a 9.1 earthquake off its northeast coast. The earthquake resulted in the devastating tsunami and riveted the whole world on the unfolding Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. The earthquake was so powerful that it was felt 230 miles away in Tokyo, causing tall buildings to just sway back and forth as much as 7 to 10 feet. My cousin Bill was in one of those buildings. Bill is a big guy, maybe 6'5", with the build of a football player. He was staying on an upper floor in a high-rise hotel, and space is at a premium in Tokyo, so the room was not much wider than Bill is tall. When the shaking started, it knocked him off his feet, and as the building swayed, it threw him back and forth, and as he crashed from one wall to the other, he figured this was it. But instead of panic, he felt oddly calm. As he later told me, I knew who I was and whose I was. We aren't in Tokyo in a high-rise in the middle of an earthquake. But the newest report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has knocked most of us off our feet. And there is, you'll excuse the expression, a whole lot of shaking going on. Basically, the report gives us 10 to 12 years to make historically unprecedented changes in the way our economies and our agricultural practices, our energy practices work before global warming dramatically reshapes our world. In searching the IPCC report and others, I stumbled across something online that frankly surprised me. The author is a man named Jem Bendel. He's a leader in sustainable development and cryptocurrencies. He's a professor of social and organizational change in the UK. He's worked with the UN and with lots of international NGOs. He writes for peer-reviewed journals, which is a whole long way for me to say the man is not a theologian. And yet, he published a list of 14 recommendations for dealing with climate despair. And at the top of his list was something that could be boiled down to 2 words: find God. Here are the words as he actually wrote it. Return to or explore afresh the idea of a divine or a spirit or a consciousness or a God that is prior to the earth and moves through the universe right now and forevermore. Do so without seeking a simple story of explanation, but a sense of faith that there is an existence and a meaning beyond our culture, our species, and our planet. Definitely not something I expect to see from someone who appears to be a secular humanist. But I am a theologian, so Bendel's words brought me to the book of Job, which is an extraordinary example of the kind of faith that Bendel is talking about, and also of a God that is prior to the earth and moves through the universe right now and forevermore. The professor knows our climate is already changing. So his question is not, will it happen? His question is, how are we going to respond when catastrophic events do happen? In the same way, the book of Job does not assume a trouble-free life. It assumes that adversity comes to us all. So the question is not whether or not it will, but what we will do, how we will respond when it comes. The book of Job asks the big questions, pertinent to every culture, every religion, every time, every place. Why do catastrophic things happen? How do we respond when circumstances throw us from one side of the room to the other? And the theological zinger, where is God in all of this? The setup of Job is a wager between God and Satan. God extols Job for being an upright man, and Satan says, well, of course he is. He's got everything. If you took all of that away, he would curse you to your face. God disagrees, and the wager begins. Now, this is a literary device. It's not a reference to any actual devil. It's a figurative way to talk about adversities that happen in the course of our lives. So the first part of the book is all about the calamities that befall Job. Tragedy strikes, and in swift succession, his 4 sons die, his 3 daughters die, many of his servants die, his fortune and all of his possessions are gone, and he is left sitting among the ashes, scraping boils from his skin with a broken piece of pottery. He's feeling utterly betrayed by God. Why? He asks. Why did this happen to me? As the book unfolds, we hear the standard explanations from Job's friends, starting with, it must be something you did. It's that ancient calculus. God rewards piety and punishes perversity. Suffering is somehow deserved and even said to be the will of God. In other advice offered by Job's friends, we hear something also echoed in our secular culture: curse God and die. Because what kind of God lets such horrible things happen? So Job's friends encourage one kind of response: curse God and die. Give up your faith. Yield to despair. But Job does something different. He demands an answer from God. And in one of the rare epiphanies in the Old Testament, and an epiphany means a direct experience of God, God answers Job. And what an epiphany it is. This is not the still small voice heard by Elijah. This is a voice that speaks from a whirlwind, from a tornado. This is the God who calls forth all of creation, from torrential rains to each tiny dewdrop, from the belt of Orion to the birth of a mountain goat. This is the Creator who balances the clouds, commands the morning, enters the springs of the sea, and walks the recesses of the deep. God shows Job the glory of creation, where glory refers to the indwelling presence of God, woven through all of life and resonating along its ancient songlines, the ancient songlines of the earth. This is creation as self-manifestation of its Creator. This is the God who keeps me coming back to these verses over and over again. But I've gotten ahead of the story. So Job demands from God an answer. The wicked deserve the calamities that befall them, but I have lived a righteous life. How is that just? And God answers with another challenge. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? And I'm always tempted to do my Jewish mother voice. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And apologies to Anyone I just offended with that? The first time that I read that, it angered me. It sounded like a crushing put down. Who are you, little man, to question me? But that's not how Job hears it. So we are obliged to dig deeper. As you might imagine, there are some pretty amazing commentaries out there on the book of Job. And the one that has worked best for me comes from Elie Wiesel, writer and Holocaust survivor. He concludes that ultimately, Job's experience of God is greater than Job's experience of suffering. Job's experience of God is greater than Job's experience of suffering. The final chapters of Job are filled with poetic images of a God so vast and yet so tender that the only possible response is an awe so deep and so wide that it overwhelms all feelings, even of horrendous suffering. That makes sense to me, that an experience of God would overwhelm the experience of suffering. But as climate change now results in suffering on a planetary scale, I am increasingly persuaded by another interpretation, that of my friend J. McDaniel. In God's response to Job, McDaniel writes, Job awakens to two things. God's response to Job. He awakens to two things. First, from a human-centered perspective, Job has missed something important about God. That God is not anthropocentric, meaning God is at least as galactic and cosmological as God is personal. God's care is not focused exclusively on human beings. God is about all being. Second, Job realizes that God's responses cannot be reduced to a formula. God does not operate according to divine algorithms, a calculus that mates out punishment for bad deeds and rewards for good deeds. God has given us the gift of freedom, which we can exercise for good or ill. And God can no more interfere with the consequences of our choices than God can interfere with those choices in the first place. What God can do is be present, guiding us ever and always toward the good, and working creatively with us, through us, all creation, ever and always, to transform what has gone wrong. In this view, God's transcendence is redefined. It is not defined as being separate from all things, but as being supremely related to all things. That is, God is internally related to all that is, and therefore is truly all in all. This is a God who transcends each of us, but without being separate from any of us. This is a transcendence that includes, rather than excludes, relation. The ancients saw stories like Job's effort to answer the classic question of why do the righteous suffer? But we are now facing a situation unimagined by the ancients and unimaginable to most of us today. There is no divine wager, literary or otherwise. So the more pertinent question for us is this: how do we respond to what may be coming? Do we curse God and die? Fall to despair? Or do we reach deep inside to contemplate who we are and whose we are. Who are we? Is our identity tied to things like our position in the world, our possessions, our looks, our achievements? These are externalities, and they are vulnerable to change. What happens when we let such externalities define us, and what happens to our identity if we lose them? And how much worse is it if we think we're entitled to them? We are seeing the rise of white nationalism because its advocates perceive a loss of status. Entitlement or privilege is subject to change. If lost, it can lead to feeling aggrieved, and then to turn to resentment, and then in turn become playing the victim. And this is not a position of strength. Years ago, those who experienced sexual abuse learned to reject the label of victim and instead lay claim to the word survivor. This is a position of strength. It reflects the ability of a strained body to recover its size and shape after being deformed by stress. And that, literally, courtesy of Merriam-Webster, is the definition of resilience. The ability to recover its original size and shape after some deformation has occurred through stress. So, whose are we? The story of Job teaches the importance of opening ourselves to God. When we do, we may get more than we bargained for. We may find our present ideas of God reduced to dust, but we may also open ourselves to an experience of God that helps us to overcome our experience of suffering and grief, despair and loss. Opening ourselves to God in this way is an act of trust and an act of hope. Trust in an ever-present God and hope that there is another side to whatever we are experiencing, whether in our lives, in the lives of those we love, or in the life of the planet itself. There is a way forward, and that way is faith. What Job learns is that the blessing of faith is not worldly goods or freedom from sickness and death. The blessing of faith is the power of endurance. Endurance, no matter what, trusting the unfailing presence of an omnipresent Creator God. So who are you? However else you may define yourself, I can assure you confidently of this: you are God's beloved. Your resilience is rooted in that awareness, grounded in the awareness of that truth. Who are you? Whose are you? I'll leave that to you.